The snowstorm raged outside, the wind howling like a chorus of voices. It wasn't the cold or the storm that made my skin crawl, though. Something was wrong, and I'd felt it the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. Now the storm seemed to swallow everything in its path, smothering sound, sight, and even thought. Inside, the only thing keeping the darkness at bay was the soft glow of my Christmas tree. But that light wasn't comforting. It flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows that danced across the walls. I sat on the couch, nursing a whiskey I didn't even want, trying to ignore the oppressive weight that had settled over the room. The lights blinked, and I noticed something unsettling. They weren't flickering randomly. No, there was a pattern. Short bursts, long pauses, like a code. My heart started to beat faster as I tried to convince myself it was just a faulty bulb. I shook my head, setting the glass down harder than I intended. "It's just the alcohol," I muttered. "That's all it is, just the damn whiskey." But then the lights blinked again, unmistakable this time. They spelled out a word: naughty. The glass slipped from my fingers, landing on the carpet with a dull thud. I leaned forward, staring at the tree as if my glare could banish the message. My breathing hitched. My rational mind fought to dismiss it. Lights don't spell words, not on their own. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Yet there it was, glowing in sharp reds and greens, mocking me. I stood up, taking a step toward the tree as the word flickered once, twice, and vanished. The lights resumed their erratic blinking, chaotic as ever, as if nothing had happened. The air in the room felt colder, biting at my skin, despite the fire crackling weakly in the hearth. I rubbed my arms and turned toward the window. Maybe the storm was getting worse. That would explain the chill. Pulling the curtain aside, I peered out into the swirling snow. At first, all I saw was white, blinding, endless white. Then my eyes caught something: tracks, bloody hoofprints trailing up the driveway, leading directly to my porch. They were huge, far too large for any animal I'd ever seen, and the crimson stains were vivid against the snow, almost fresh. My breath caught, and my grip tightened on the curtain. My pulse thundered in my ears as I tried to think of an explanation. A prank, maybe. Kids screwing around. But in a storm like this, no one would be out there. No one should be. I let the curtain fall back and took a step away from the window, bumping into the coffee table. The whiskey glass tipped and rolled onto the floor, but I barely noticed. My eyes darted toward the door, half expecting it to burst open. The unease from earlier had grown into full-blown dread. The lights on the tree flickered again, but this time they weren't alone. A soft sound joined them, so faint I almost missed it. Bells. Faint jingling, carried on the wind. I strained to listen, holding my breath, but the sound disappeared as quickly as it had come. I didn't have long to dwell on it. A sharp, deliberate knock echoed through the house. My head snapped toward the door, and my body froze. Another knock followed, louder this time, then a third, each one more forceful than the last. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there. The hoofprints. My stomach churned as I stepped toward the door, my movements stiff and hesitant. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence answered me, thick and suffocating. I glanced around the room, my eyes landing on the fireplace poker resting near the hearth. My hands shook as I grabbed it, the cold metal grounding me just enough to approach the door again. I said, "Who's there?" Still nothing. Swallowing hard, I unbolted the door and opened it just a crack. The storm hit me instantly, snow swirling in and biting at my face. For a moment, I couldn't see anything but white. Then my eyes fell on the thing sitting on the porch. It was a doll, charred and grotesque. The porcelain face was untouched, unnervingly pristine, with a grin that stretched too wide. Hollow black eyes stared back at me, unblinking. The rest of the doll's body was burnt, blackened, and cracked, as if it had been pulled from a fire. I reached down, hesitant but compelled, my fingers brushing the scorched fabric. The moment I touched it, a sound cut through the storm, laughter, high-pitched and distant, like a child's giggle carried on the wind. My stomach turned as I yanked my hand back, stumbling inside and slamming the door shut. I bolted it and leaned against the wood, my chest heaving. The laughter lingered in my ears, even as silence reclaimed the house. My grip on the poker tightened, and I backed away from the door, keeping my eyes on it, as if expecting it to explode inward. The air grew heavier, colder, as though the warmth of the fire had been sucked out of the room. I glanced at the Christmas tree, half expecting the lights to spell another message, but they remained still. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then the scratching started. It had been exactly 1 year ago. Christmas Eve, same as tonight. I'd been drunk back then, too, passed out on the couch when I heard the noise. A loud thud from the roof, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or some other animal, but the noise was heavy, too heavy for any animal that should have been out in a snowstorm. I'd grabbed the shotgun from the closet, hands still shaking from too much whiskey and not enough sleep. I wasn't thinking clearly, wasn't ready for what I was about to see. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a scraping sound, like something, or someone, trying to shimmy down the chimney. My heart raced as I backed toward the fireplace, pointing the shotgun at the empty hearth. I remember thinking, this is insane. It can't be real. But then he appeared. There was ash everywhere, billowing out in a dark cloud as he tumbled out of the chimney. He landed on his feet, brushing the soot off his red suit with an annoyed grunt. He wasn't what I expected. Bigger, for one, with a beard that practically glowed white against the grime covering him. He looked at me with these piercing eyes that practically twinkled, and I froze. The room felt impossibly still. "Ho, ho," he started to say, but I panicked. My finger pulled the trigger before I even realized what I was doing. The shot rang out, deafening in the small space. He stumbled backward, crashing into the coffee table. The sack he'd been carrying spilled open, toys scattering across the floor like a grotesque parody of Christmas morning. Blood soaked into the rug, stark against the cheerful lights of the tree. He didn't move. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at his body, trying to convince myself that it wasn't real, that it was a hallucination or a cruel trick of my drunken mind. But the smell of blood and burnt flesh told me otherwise. My hands were still shaking when I dragged his body out into the woods behind my house and buried him in the snow. I told myself no one would believe me anyway. I barely believed it myself. A sharp thud jolted me back to the present. My heart leapt as I stared at the front door, the sound echoing in the stillness of the room. I stood, gripping the whiskey glass tightly, and moved toward the window. Outside, the snow fell thick and fast, but through the darkness, I saw them. Bloody hoofprints leading from the street, up my driveway, and stopping at the porch. They were massive, impossibly large, and the crimson stains against the white snow made my stomach churn. The sound came again, 3 deliberate knocks, each one louder than the last. My breath caught as I stepped toward the door, the fireplace poker now clutched in my free hand. "Who's there?" My voice trembled. No answer. Swallowing hard, I unbolted the door and opened it just a crack. The cold hit me like a slap, and for a moment I couldn't see anything but swirling snow. Then my eyes fell on it. A doll, charred and grotesque, sitting upright on the porch. Its face was porcelain, untouched by whatever fire had burned the rest of it, and its grin stretched unnaturally wide. Hollow black eyes seemed to stare right through me. I reached down with trembling fingers to pick it up, but the moment I touched its surface, I heard it. A faint, high-pitched giggle, carried on the wind like a ghostly echo. My hand recoiled and I stumbled back, slamming the door shut and bolting it. My pulse thundered as I backed into the living room, the poker held tight. The air felt heavier now, colder, as though the warmth of the fireplace was being sucked out of the room. I glanced at the tree, half expecting the lights to start spelling out messages again, but it remained still. For a moment, I almost believed I'd imagined it all. Then the scratching started. It was faint at first, like a branch brushing against the side of the house, but it grew louder, more deliberate, moving across the roof in slow, heavy strokes. My heart raced as I stared at the ceiling, willing the sound to stop. And then it did. The silence that followed was deafening, but it lasted only a moment before the footsteps began. Heavy, deliberate thuds echoed above me, shaking the chandelier and rattling the ornaments on the tree. I held my breath, gripping the poker so tightly my knuckles ached. The footsteps stopped directly above me, and the lights on the tree flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. When they came back on, the ornaments were rattling, and the lights blinked again, spelling out the same word: naughty. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it the faint sound of jingling bells. My chest tightened as the sound grew louder, joined by a deep, guttural laugh that made my blood run cold. Ho, ho, ho. The voice wasn't human. It was deep and ragged, like something clawing its way out of a grave. And it wasn't coming from the roof anymore. It was inside. The thudding on the roof was relentless, each crash reverberating through the house like the wrath of a winter storm given form. I gripped the fireplace poker tighter, the metal biting into my palm as I took slow steps toward the center of the room. My breath fogged in the cold air, each exhale a reminder that something unnatural was here. A sound tore through the quiet, a deep, guttural scraping, like claws raking over wood. It moved across the roof with purpose, pausing above me. My heart hammered as I stared at the ceiling, every muscle in my body screaming for me to run, but my legs were rooted to the floor. Then came the crash. The roof buckled inward with a thunderous roar as something massive landed in the middle of my living room. Debris flew everywhere, a choking cloud of dust and snow filling the space. I stumbled backward, coughing, the poker held in front of me like a flimsy shield. When the dust cleared, I wished it hadn't. It was him, or at least what used to be him, Santa. His eyes glowed a menacing yellow, hollow pits that burned with something far beyond anger. His face was a grotesque mask of decay, the skin gray and sloughing off in patches to reveal rotting flesh beneath. Jagged teeth jutted from his blackened gums, each one glistening as though wet with venom. The red suit I'd once shot him in was shredded, soaked with blood and grime, and his once white beard hung in filthy, matted clumps. His bulk filled the room, his shoulders heaving as he took a step toward me, the floor groaning under his weight. "Naughty," he growled, the word rolling out of him like thunder, deep and ragged. His lips twisted into a hideous parody of a smile, exposing more of those jagged teeth. He raised one hand, the fingers tipped with claws that glinted like icicles in the firelight. I moved before I thought, swinging the poker with every ounce of strength I had. The metal connected with his arm, and the sound it made wasn't what I expected. It was wet, a sickening thwack, followed by the splatter of something viscous against the floor. He didn't flinch. Instead, he turned those glowing eyes toward me, his twisted smile widening. "You think that hurts me?" His voice was a low rumble, carrying an almost amused tone. I swung again, this time aiming for his head. The poker hit with a dull crack, and for a moment, he staggered. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I bolted past him, my feet slipping on the blood-slick floor as I made for the kitchen. Behind me, his laughter boomed, echoing through the house like a mockery of every Christmas morning I'd ever known. I grabbed the first weapon I could find, a baseball bat propped against the back door, and spun around just as he barreled into the kitchen. His bulk shattered the doorway, splintering wood and sending shards flying. His claws swiped at me, and I barely dodged in time, the air hissing as they sliced past my face. The bat came down on his shoulder, hard, and this time he roared. The sound shook the walls, a guttural cry of rage that made my knees weaken. He swung at me again, but the cramped space worked in my favor. His massive frame caught on the counters, giving me a split second to act. I swung the bat at his knee, and he crumpled, one leg buckling under him. "You'll pay for this," he snarled, his red eyes burning brighter. I didn't wait for him to recover. I darted past him, out the back door and into the storm. The cold hit me like a wall, but I barely felt it over the adrenaline coursing through me. Behind me, his laughter rang out again, louder this time, carrying on the wind as I stumbled into the snow-covered yard. I didn't make it far. The storm was too thick, the snow too deep. My legs felt like lead as I trudged toward the street, every instinct screaming at me to look back. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. That's when I saw them. At first I thought they were shadows, flickering in the storm. Then the wind shifted, and the figures came into focus. They were small, no taller than children, but their proportions were all wrong. Their limbs were too thin, their heads too large, and their faces, God, their faces. They were frozen in grotesque grins, their skin pale and cracked like porcelain. Empty eyes glowed faintly, the same hellish red as Santa's, and their movements were jerky, as though they were marionettes controlled by invisible strings. The elves. One of them stepped forward, tilting its head as it regarded me with that empty, soulless stare. Then it opened its mouth, and a chorus of distorted giggles erupted from the others. The sound was wrong, layered with something deeper, darker, like the echo of a child's laugh, twisted into something sinister. They advanced as one, their movements unnervingly synchronized. I stumbled back, raising the bat, but it felt useless against the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. "They're coming for you," a voice growled behind me. I turned to see Santa standing in the doorway, his massive form silhouetted against the firelight inside. "You think you can escape? My elves will make sure you..." Stay put. The elves broke into a sprint, their jerky movements transforming into something nightmarishly fast. I swung the bat wildly, connecting with one and sending it flying, but two more took its place, their clawed hands reaching for me. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat as I fought to keep them at bay. The battle blurred into chaos. I don't remember how I managed to make it back into the house, only that the door slammed behind me and I collapsed against it, panting. The storm outside howled, but the elves didn't follow. Their laughter faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the crackling of the fire. Santa was gone, for now, but I knew he'd be back. And next time, he wouldn't be alone. The cold gnawed at my face as I stepped out into the snow, the baseball bat clutched tightly in my hands. The storm had eased, but the stillness was worse. The silence hung heavy, broken only by the crunch of my boots against the ice-crusted snow. Every shadow seemed alive, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye sending jolts of panic through my chest. I had to find help. Someone, anyone. But as I moved down the street, the houses loomed like monuments to something unspeakable. The first house I came to belonged to the Watsons, a sweet couple who always had their lights up early. But tonight their decorations were wrong. The front yard was littered with torn, bloodied clothing half buried in the snow. The Christmas lights draped across the porch had been twisted into grotesque shapes. A reindeer missing its head, a snowman with crimson streaks smeared across its torso. The front door hung open, swinging slightly in the wind. "Hello?" My voice cracked as I stepped closer. No answer. The Watsons' living room was worse. The smell hit me first, a rancid mix of copper and rot. Then I saw the tree. It was enormous, draped in entrails instead of tinsel, with ornaments that looked far too real to be store-bought. As I moved closer, I realized they were real. Severed fingers dangled from hooks, their nails painted with holiday cheer, and eyeballs glistened among the branches like morbid baubles. My stomach churned as I backed out of the house, bile rising in my throat. My feet slipped on something wet, and I looked down to see a pool of blood spreading out from beneath a pile of torn gifts. A hand, still clutching a crumpled piece of wrapping paper, stuck out from underneath the mess. I ran. The next house was worse, and the one after that, each one a macabre display of death and twisted festivity. A wreath made of intestines hung on one door. Another had Christmas carols playing softly from a record player, the sound distorted and warping, punctuated by guttural screams. I didn't dare enter those houses, but the glimpses through the windows told me enough. Blood streaked the walls, shadows moved within, unnatural and jerky. I stopped in the middle of the street, my breath fogging in the icy air as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The storm had carried more than snow. It had carried death. A scream tore through the night, sharp and panicked. It sounded like Lisa, the neighbor who always invited me over for coffee when the weather turned bad. Without thinking, I followed the sound. The bat gripped so tightly, my fingers ached. "Lisa?" I called, my voice breaking. The scream came again, leading me to her house at the end of the street. Her living room window was shattered, jagged shards of glass glittering in the snow. Inside, the lights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows. I climbed through the window, ignoring the sting as a shard sliced into my arm. The house was eerily quiet, except for the faint hum of Christmas music playing somewhere deeper inside. "Lisa?" I whispered, stepping into the kitchen. Blood streaked the linoleum floor, and a single high-heeled shoe lay abandoned near the sink. Then I saw it, a tripwire taut and glinting in the dim light. My foot froze inches from it. Before I could react, laughter erupted from behind me, high-pitched and layered like a dozen voices overlapping. I spun around, but the kitchen was empty. The laughter grew louder, closer, and the room seemed to shrink around me. My pulse thundered as I swung the bat wildly, hitting nothing but air. The first elf dropped from the ceiling, landing on the counter with a sickening crunch. Its porcelain-like face split into a grin, and its hollow, glowing eyes locked onto mine. Naughty, it hissed, its voice a chorus of whispers. It lunged, and I swung the bat with everything I had. The impact sent it flying into the wall, where it crumpled, twitching. But more were coming. They poured in from the hallways, the ceiling, the very shadows themselves, their claws clicking against the floors as they advanced. I backed into the living room, swinging the bat at anything that moved, but it was useless. There were too many. I don't know how I escaped. One moment I was surrounded, their claws tearing at my jacket, their laughter filling my ears. The next, I was stumbling back into the street, bleeding and gasping for air. The elves didn't follow. They stood in the doorway, their grins wide as they watched me collapse into the snow. The air felt heavier as I sat there, staring at the sky. Snowflakes fell slowly, lazily, like the world didn't care about the carnage below. I wanted to give up, to let the cold take me, but something caught my eye, a flicker of light in the attic of the old Johnson house. I don't know why I went there. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was desperation. But as I climbed through the broken window and into the dusty attic, I found it. A book, an ancient tome, its leather cover cracked with age. It radiated something dark, something powerful. The pages were filled with scrawled handwriting and grotesque illustrations. As I flipped through, the pieces fell into place. Santa wasn't just a man. He was a spirit, bound by the sacred rules of Christmas. Breaking those rules, killing him, had unleashed something unspeakable. His rage had corrupted everything, twisting the joy of the season into a weapon of destruction. And now he wanted revenge, not just on me, but on everyone. The town wasn't a warning. It was the beginning. The attic was colder than the storm outside, the air thick with a foreboding that seeped into my bones. The book lay open on the floor, its scrawled warnings etched into my brain. I didn't have long. Santa, no, that thing I'd unleashed, would come back soon, and this time, I needed to be ready. I dragged myself back to my house, ignoring the stabbing pain in my side and the blood soaking through my jacket. Every step felt like a death march, but I wasn't going to die. Not without a fight. My house looked like a war zone in progress within minutes. I raided every cabinet, drawer, and closet, searching for anything I could turn into a weapon. I started with the candy canes hanging from the tree. Their pointed ends, sharpened further with the blade of my kitchen knife, became jagged spikes. Then came the eggnog. Bottles of the thick, creamy liquid were emptied and refilled with gasoline I siphoned from my car, their necks stuffed with torn rags. Molotov cocktails, crude but effective. The centerpiece was my makeshift crossbow. I found an old set of Christmas lights in the garage, their cord thick and sturdy. After rigging the lights to a broken slingshot and a piece of scrap wood, I had a weapon capable of launching sharpened ornaments. A box of vintage glass balls became my ammunition. each one fragile enough to shatter on impact and send shards flying. I worked through the night, the adrenaline keeping exhaustion at bay. Every creak of the floorboards or whistle of the wind outside made my heart race, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. By the time the sun threatened to rise, my house was a fortress of traps and improvised weaponry. Strings of lights crisscrossed the windows, rigged to tripwire explosives. A wreath of bells hung on the front door, rigged to sound an alarm if anything passed through. I sat in the living room, the bat across my lap, and the crossbow at my side. The tree lights flickered again, casting the word naughty in an eerie glow across the walls. My grip tightened on the bat as I whispered, "Come on, you bastard. I'm ready for you." The first attack came just as dawn broke. The front door splintered inward, the sound like a gunshot in the stillness. Snow blew in, swirling around the hulking figure that stepped through. Zombie Santa. His glowing yellow eyes burned with fury, and his grotesque, rotting face twisted into a sneer. Behind him came the elves, dozens of them. Their porcelain faces grinned maniacally as they scuttled into the house on all fours, their claws clicking against the floor. Each one was twisted in some new, horrifying way. One had fingers like razor-sharp ornaments, the tips gleaming with blood. Another opened its mouth to reveal rows of candy cane fangs, dripping with something viscous and green. "Naughty," Santa growled, his voice a guttural echo that rattled the windows. I didn't wait for them to come to me. I grabbed the crossbow, loaded it with a glass ornament, and fired. The ornament shattered against Santa's shoulder, sending shards slicing into his flesh. He roared, but before he could retaliate, I threw one of the Molotov cocktails. The flames erupted, engulfing two of the elves and sending the others scattering. The battle turned the house into a chaotic nightmare. The elves were relentless, swarming over furniture and walls, their laughter filling the air like a twisted carol. One of them lunged at me, its clawed hands reaching for my throat. I swung the bat, the impact sending it crashing into the Christmas tree, where it writhed among the branches before going still. Another elf, its face half melted, with one eye oozing black ichor, spat molten sugar at me. The liquid hit my arm, burning through my jacket and searing my skin. I screamed, dropping the bat, but managed to grab a candy cane spike and drive it into the creature's chest. It shrieked, its body convulsing before it collapsed. The fight lasted for what felt like hours. My traps slowed them down, but didn't stop them. Every time I thought I'd killed one, two more seemed to take its place. By the time the horde thinned, my house was in ruins. The tree was on fire, the ornaments shattered across the floor. Blood, red and black, streaked the walls. Santa stood in the doorway, watching as his elves retreated back into the storm. His glowing eyes burned with unholy light, and his laughter filled the wreckage of my home. He hadn't been defeated, not yet. "I'll be back, Marcus," he growled, his voice dripping with menace. "This isn't over." And then he was gone, his massive form disappearing into the snow, leaving me alone in the smoldering remains of what used to be my house. I dropped to my knees, the bat slipping from my grasp. The snowstorm raged around me as I trudged into the heart of town, the wind howling like a pack of wolves. My house was gone, reduced to ash and rubble, but I wasn't done. Santa's laugh still echoed in my ears, a taunting promise that he'd be back. He hadn't just destroyed my home, he'd destroyed everything. The town square loomed ahead, the massive Christmas tree standing tall in the center, its lights pulsating like a beating heart. Something about it felt alive, malevolent, as though it were watching me. My fingers tightened around the baseball bat. I still had the crossbow slung over my shoulder and the last of the Molotovs strapped to my belt. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. "Come on, you bastard," I muttered, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "Let's finish this." He didn't make me wait long. The wind stilled for a moment, a suffocating silence falling over the square. Then, with a deafening crash, he appeared. Zombie Santa stepped out of the storm, his massive frame illuminated by the glow of the cursed Christmas tree. His eyes burned brighter than ever. Twin orbs of yellow fire set into his decaying face. The shredded remains of his suit flapped in the wind, revealing patches of rotting flesh beneath. He carried a massive sack over one shoulder, its contents writhing as though alive. "You've been very naughty, Marcus," he growled, his voice a low rumble that shook the ground beneath my feet. "And now it's time for your punishment." He slammed the sack to the ground, and it burst open, releasing a horde of spectral reindeer. Their glowing eyes fixed on me, their flaming hooves igniting the snow as they charged. I barely had time to dive out of the way as the lead reindeer's antlers gouged the spot where I'd been standing moments before. The battle began in earnest. I rolled to my feet and grabbed the crossbow, loading it with a sharpened ornament. The first shot caught one of the reindeer in the side, shattering on impact and sending shards slicing through its translucent form. It howled, a sound like a winter gale, before dissolving into wisps of smoke. But there were more, so many more. I dodged and weaved through the square, the flaming hooves of the reindeer scorching the ground around me. One of them caught me with its antlers, tossing me into a snowbank. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I scrambled to my feet, clutching a Molotov. "Let's see how you like this," I whispered, lighting the rag and hurling it into the pack. The explosion lit up the night, engulfing two of the reindeer in flames. They shrieked as they disintegrated, their fiery hooves leaving blackened craters in the snow. Santa watched from the base of the tree, his laugh booming over the chaos. "You can't win, Marcus," he taunted. "I am Christmas. I am eternal." But I wasn't listening. My eyes locked on the hat perched atop his head. It wasn't just a hat. It was the hat, the source of his power, the thing that had kept him alive after I'd killed him. If I could destroy it, I could end this. I fought my way through the reindeer, using the bat to smash the last of them into a cloud of ash. My body ached, my lungs burned, but I kept moving. Santa turned to face me as I approached, his grin widening. "You think you can defeat me?" he growled. "You're nothing but a mortal." "Maybe," I shot back, raising the bat, "but even mortals can deliver one hell of a punch." I swung the bat at his head, but he caught it mid-swing, his massive hand closing around the wood like a vice. He yanked it out of my grip and tossed it aside, his other hand lashing out to grab me by the throat. His grip was like iron, lifting me off the ground as I struggled to breathe. "You're a fool, Marcus," he snarled, his face inches from mine. "You can't stop me." But I wasn't trying to stop him. My hand found the lighter in my pocket, and with the last of my strength, I flicked it open and set the flame against the tree behind him. The cursed tree went up like a bonfire, the flames climbing high into the night sky. Santa roared, dropping me as he turned to face the inferno. "No," he bellowed, his voice shaking the earth. The fire consumed the tree, its pulsating lights flickering and dying as the flames devoured it. The heat was intense, the air filled with the acrid smell of burning pine and something far darker. The flames reached Santa's hat, and he screamed, a sound of pure agony. His body convulsed, the glow fading from his eyes as the fire consumed him. The last thing I saw before he collapsed into ash was the hat disintegrating, its cursed power finally broken. The town lay in ruins, a graveyard of shattered homes and blood-stained snow. The Christmas tree in the square was nothing more than a smoldering husk, its malevolence gone, but the scars it left behind eternal. The air smelled of ash and death, every step crunching over broken glass and charred remains. I stood there, bat in hand, surveying the aftermath. My body was broken, cuts and burns crisscrossing my arms, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could still feel Santa's grip around my throat, the weight of his hatred pressing down on me. But it was over. It had to be. I turned and began walking, the silence of the town broken only by the faint sound of the wind. My house was gone, my neighbors were gone, and whatever spirit of Christmas had existed here had been twisted into something monstrous. I vowed then and there, with every ounce of strength I had left, that I would never celebrate Christmas again. The snow began to fall again, soft and quiet, covering the horror like a shroud. I stopped for a moment, staring at the white blanket spreading across the ground. That's when I heard it, faint at first, almost lost in the storm, but unmistakable. The jingling of bells. I froze, the bats slipping from my fingers as the sound grew louder, carrying with it a chill that no snowstorm could match. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The bells faded into the wind, leaving behind an unsettling silence. I turned and kept walking, my footsteps heavy and slow. Was it over? Or was this just the beginning of something far worse? I didn't want to know. I just wanted to survive.